let's take the show on the road.
Are we ready? Ladies and gentlemen. Oh, ladies and gentlemen. Do I have everyone's attention? Peace, everyone. Peace, folklorists. Oh my god, you can do better than that. Good evening, folklorists. Thank God. This is the 2016 Don Yoder Lecture in Religious Folk Life. It is sponsored by the Folk Belief section of the and Religious Folk Life section of the American Folklore Society, and this year with the American Folklore Society's Jewish Folklore and Ethnology section together. And of course, for those that perhaps did not know who Don Yoder was or is, Don Yoder was professor of folklore and folk life for many years at the University of Pennsylvania, and he died in August of 2015 at age 93. And about 4 or 5 months ago, his last book, The German Bible in America, was published. And so, God love him, he was writing to the very end. And this lecture is now in his memory, a wonderful teacher and mentor and scholar, and we really do cherish his memory. And we have never had a paper or a lecture which was about on the subject of the religious folk life in Judaism, Jewish religious folk life. And so Maggie and I were discussing this with Simon Bronner, and who of course came to mind was naturally Dan Ben-Amos. Now, of course, Maggie and I also sat around and we thought, now, gee, we wish we could hire a young Turk. We could wish we could get a young Turk to come. Oh my God, we found one. I don't think it's. I don't really want to. I shouldn't take up a lot of time telling you because you all know Dan Ben-Amos. He's one of the major figures in world folkloristics, and certainly a major figure in folkloristics in the United States. He's was one of my wonderful teachers in the graduate folklore and folklife program at Penn, and he's a scholar who has spent many, many years giving us his wonderful scholarship in so many topics involving African folklore, Jewish folklore, humor, the history of folkloristics, and I love it. I think, Dan, one thing I read about you said that you also published about structuralism. Would you agree with that? He's very modest, and we're so thrilled to have him here to address us today in this occasion when we have so many scholars from all over the world here in Miami. So, Dan is currently professor of folklore in the Department of Near Eastern Languages at the University of Pennsylvania. For those that did not know, his PhD is from Indiana University. And I really am, Maggie and I are just thrilled that he could be here tonight to give this Don Yoder lecture. The title of his lecture is Kol Nidre, the prayer that haunted the rabbis and charmed their folks. I give you the Don Yoder lecture for 2016, Dan Ben-Amos.
Thank you, Leonard. I'm glad that you made me a young Turk, and this was a group that Richard Dawson put me together, put me in it, and last year I visited Turkey in a congress of the same organization that we share now, with which we share now the meeting. And I was welcomed like a native son in Turkey, and I was very happy about it. Some of my friends from Turkey are here, and I hope they will enjoy my lecture. We began to honor Professor Yoder with a plenary lecture at the annual meeting of 2003 of the American Folklore Society. The first lecture was delivered by Professor David Hafford and was about folk life and the triumph of folk medicine. Professor Yoder himself delivered 2 lectures in this forum in 2006 and 2013. Last year, at the annual meeting of the American Folklore Society in Long Beach, California, Professor Erica Brady delivered her lecture on Subtle Things Withal, Reflections on the Ineffable, the Unspeakable, and the Risible in Vernacular Religion, which became the first lecture that was not only in Dan Yoder's honor, but also in his memory. Professor Dan Yoder passed away on Tuesday, August 11, 2015, at the age of 93. The last time I saw Professor Dan Yoder was at the 2013 annual meeting of the American Folklore Society in Providence, Rhode Island. He attended the session in which Amy Schumann interviewed me, and at the end of the interview, Dan Yoder approached the microphone and said, "Dan, I hired you to the University of Pennsylvania." All those years, this simple fact eluded me. Before joining its faculty, my major contact with the University of Pennsylvania took place through Professor Kenneth Goldstein, with whom I corresponded. He was the person with whom I spoke and with whom I corresponded. But at that time in the 60s, after the retirement of Professor McEdward Leach, Dan Yoder was at the helm of the budding department. He had a joint appointment in the Department of Religious Studies and the program of Folklore and Folk Life, to which he later transferred completely. Dan was a modest person, but his quiet way had a major impact as an educator and as a scholar. In a bibliography that Sue Samuelson compiled and edited in celebration of the 20th anniversary of the department, she noted that 48% of the dissertation that students wrote were on the subject related to folk life studies. Of course, we cannot discount the influence of Professor Henry Glassy had on students. He shared scholarly interest with Dan Yoder and joined the department in 1976. Yet, in his quiet demeanor, Dan Yoder had a major influence on students at the University of Pennsylvania and on folklore studies in America in general. The proverb, "Still waters run deep," suits well his way in scholarship. When I first met him, he pointed out to me that Joshua Trachtenberg, a rabbi from Easton, Pennsylvania, and Teaneck, New Jersey, was the first to use the term folk religion in English in the title of his book, Jewish Magic and Superstition, a Study in Folk Religion. At that time, I assumed that this informational tidbit was part of Yoder's regional eruditions. But later, when I read in 1974 his seminal article toward the definition of folk religion in Western Folklore, volume 33, 1974, and noticed his discussion of the contribution that Joshua Trachtenberg made to the study of folk religion, I realized that his casual comment to me was based on a careful reading and thoughtful preparation for his article on the definition for folk religions. Once I read his essay, I became puzzled by the mysterious ways of history of scholarship. In his personal shyness, Dan Yoder never shared with me his thought while he was working on an issue that paralleled my own folkloristic interests. Each of us published articles with almost identical titles 3 years apart. But if history of scholarship and social relations are puzzling, religion holds even greater puzzle for us. 9 days ago, at sundown, Jews around the world began to celebrate the holiest day of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur. This is a day of fast and prayer that begins with the most solemn prayer in the Jewish religion, the Kol Nidre prayer, that is repeated 3 times by a cantor. The paintings that you see is the work of a young Jewish Polish artist, Maurice Gottlieb, 1856 to 1879, who created it in 1878 at the age of 22, a year before he died. The young man at the center of the is a self-portrait, but also the 2 young children are portraits of the artist as a child. The Torah scroll, held by the older man, bears a memorial plaque for the artist in Hebrew with the foreboding date of 1878, a plaque that is in memory of himself. In her description of the painting, Gabrielle Saint-Reina interprets the artist's self-portrait as an image of tormented soul, and pointed out that biographically he indeed was torn between his Polish and Jewish identities. The ominous memorial plaque reflects the torment and anxiety of the day, which according to Jewish myth and religion is the day of the divine decision concerning life and death of human beings during the forthcoming year. Yet, the text of the opening prayer of the day conveys none of the emotional awe with which the praying congregation is engulfed, and none of the anxiety the rest of the prayers which are uttered during the opening evening and the rest of the next day convey. The incongruity between words and emotions perplexed some of the best scholars of Jewish studies, who have regarded the Kol Nidre prayer to be a problem, enigma, a paradox, or even a curiosity. Once a year, on the eve of Yom Kippur, in synagogues all over the world, Jews usher the service with a brief, awe-striking recitation, repeating it 3 times. And it is repeated by a cantor. didn't work. This is a studio recording because no musical instrument will be played at the synagogue at that time. I'll not repeat 3 times and we'll stop here, but I think you got the gist of the type of the melody, and you can imagine a whole community listening with awe and trepidations of what's coming to be next year, listening to this cantorial recitation. The words, and I gave them, are in Aramaic and a little bit of Hebrew. All vows, bonds, promises, obligations, and oaths wherewith we have vowed, sworn, and bound ourselves from this day of atonement until the next day of atonement, may it come unto us for good. Lo, all of this we repent us in them. They shall be absolved, released, annulled, made void, and of none effect. They shall not be binding, nor shall they have any power. Our vows shall not be vows, our bonds shall not be bonds, and our oath shall not be oath. The word of this recitation barely convey the awe they resonate. In the original Aramaic, the Kol Nidre consists of 4 verbal sequences grouped into 8 nouns, 4 positive verbs, followed by 7 verbs in the negative, and conclude with 3 statements that leave no room for any doubt about the definitive annulment of any future vow during the forthcoming year. The terms of these recitations are apparently drawn from the legal domain and explicitly void any agreement of any kind for a year time. But the solemnity with which they are uttered and the communal apprehension they inspire stand in stark contrast to the legalistic argument they evoke. This disparity between semantics and the emotive charge of the term confused those who tried to bridge this gap. Kol Nidre has been termed, as I mentioned before, a paradox, an enigma, and a riddle, or a curious case. Its enigmatic nature is multidimensional. How the name of God is an absent from this opening of this service on the holiest day of the year. How could such a prayer be in Aramaic when most of the prayer book consists of text in Hebrew? And how could a prayer consist of terms taken from the language of contracts and legal discourse? But the greatest enigma of all is how this prayer can actually exist at all. As a public abolition of all social and commercial contracts, Kol Nidre appears to have been a liability for the Jews. The communal absolution of vows once a year in the opening moments of the most solemn annual ritual, when the issue of life and death is at stake, when in the mythology of Jewish religion, God is inscribing people for life and death during the next year, is potentially disruptive recitations that opens the way for lawlessness and disorder. It absolves or suspends any obligations, any social transactions that require a preparatory phase, a commitment that precedes implementations are at risk. It invalidates verbal contracts, handshakes, or toasts. It shakes the foundations of engagements, casts doubt on any manifestations of intent, and could disrupt the economic foundation of a community, sowing seeds of distrust, suspicions, and social instability. If any commitment can be undone with one public general renunciation, what value does it have? Its potential harmful effects resonates in the modern prayer books in America. In the English section of the prayer book, an introductory note precedes the Kol Nidre. The following notice: Whereas the Hebrew text does not specify what vows are meant, it was clearly understood by Jews at all times that the recital of the Kol Nidre could not release one from vows and obligations made to his fellow men. This is evident from the following section of the Mishnah, the authoritative code of laws which antedate the Kol Nidre by at least 500 years. Only willful enemies of the truth persist in distorting the meaning of the Kol Nidre. And this is the quotation from the Mishnah. For transgressions between man and God, repentance on Yom Kippur brings atonement. For the transgressions between men and men, Yom Kippur brings no atonement until the injured party is appeased. With all due respect to the editor of the prayer book, the Mishnah refers to Yom Kippur itself and does not mention the prayer Kol Nidre, about which the sages of the Mishnah could not have known, because Kol Nidre is, as I'll mention later, it was documented only 600 years after the Mishnah was edited. This indeed has been the customary interpretation of the rabbis, and it has been instituted by customs in many communities of asking forgiveness from friends, neighbors, and maybe even social or business competitors on the eve of Yom Kippur. In order to affirm these interpretations, the editor of the English prayer book inserted in brackets in the text after the words oath and vows the phrase to God, to bring the current text in line with the rabbinical interpretations. But how could the Mishnah, traditionally assumed to be codified at the end of the 2nd century, offer an explanation or justification for text that entered the prayer book 600 years later? Isn't it an apologetic interpretation that recognizes and attempts to smooth over the negative social impact of the Kol Nidre on social life in the community? Its use is in particularly relevant to Jewish life in the diaspora, for its potential disruptive effects are even more harmful to a community of merchants that live within an ethnically heterogeneous society. When trust has to cross ethnic and linguistic boundaries, and when social and family loyalty cannot serve as a bonding in commercial transactions, the declaration that a vow is not a vow, and consequently a pledge is not a pledge, makes the erosion of reliability all but complete. For the non-Jewish community, Kol Nidre only reinforces the negative image of the Jews as conniving, unreliable, and untrustworthy. Not surprisingly, in the Middle Ages, the Geonim, these were the leading rabbis in the early Middle Ages, rejected the prayer outright. And 1,000 years later, in the 19th century, the Reform movements excised the prayer from the Siddur, from the prayer book. And only in the 30s, in the United States, the Central Conference of American Rabbis began a process of deliberation to readmit the prayer into the service. The discussion concluded in favor of inclusion only after the end of the Second World War, after the Holocaust. This became a memorial, the prayer, of the Jewish life that was lost. In between these two oppositions to the prayer, the initial rejection of the Geonim and the modern opposition of the Jewish Reformation, Jewish rabbis struggled with the very existence of such a prayer, proposed a variety of interpretations that would explain it away, excuse its existence, and read into it meaning that would enable us to retain the text in the service and at the same time restore social and economic trust and reliability in the community. But for modern scholars, not the rabbis, who seek to analyze the prayer and to explain its use in the service, Kol Nidre is still enigmatic. Shlomo Deshen, an anthropologist in Israel, recorded this puzzle in the title of his seminal article on the subject, The Kol Nidre Enigma, an anthropological view of the Day of Atonement liturgy. Herman Kivel, an American scholar, points out some of the curiosity of the prayers, and these are sort of established curiosity. In our time, he writes, the best-known ritual of the high holiday services, not only among Jews but among Christians as well, is unquestionably Kol Nidre, highlighted by its strategic location at the very inauguration of the 24-hour Fast of Atonement, and chanted in a traditional melody of great spiritual force. Kol Nidre exerts enormous impact. Yet few of the millions who experience that impact every year are aware of the paradoxical and controversial history of Kol Nidre rite. The first of these paradoxes lies in the fact that Kol Nidre is not even a prayer, but a rather legal formula for annulment of certain types of vows. The name of God is never mentioned. The language is a curious mixture of Aramaic, the Jewish vernacular of the Talmudic period, and Hebrew, the language of the classical Jewish prayer. The style is prosaic, the wording technical. Moreover, although Kol Nidre has become virtually synonymous with the Day of Atonement, it is not, strictly speaking, part of the Yom Kippur liturgy. It is a prefatory declaration which must be recited before the sunset, which ushers the holy day. The very inclusion of such a recitation in a religious service, let alone the service of the holiest day of the year, has been puzzling. The attempt to solve this puzzle are many. The scholarly literature on this prayer is substantial. The 10 or so lines of the prayer generated thousand-fold lines of interpretations. To my knowledge, there are two important monographs on this prayer in English, one in German, and substantial amount of scholarly articles in Hebrew, English, German, French, and other languages. In a glance, it is possible to delineate the issues with which this literature deals as follows. Place of origin, whether the prayer was generated or began in Palestine or in Babylonia, and also, and I'll mention, there was one trend to suggest that it was started in Spain. Second, the application of absolutions. Is it for the past or the future transactions? And third, the nature of the recitation. Is it a legal statement or a magical incantation? Let me briefly go through this fault line of the Kol Nidre debate. The biblical inscriptions or descriptions of the Day Atonement service, which is in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 26 to 32, concentrates on sacrifices, rest, and self-denial. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Mark the 10th day of this 7th month of the Day of Atonement. It shall be sacred occasion for you. You shall practice self-denial and you shall bring an offering by fire to the Lord. You shall do no work throughout the day, for it is a day of atonement, on which expiation is made on your behalf before the Lord of your God. Indeed, any person who does not practice self-denial throughout the day shall be cut off from his kin. And whoever does any work throughout the day, I will cause that person to perish from among his people. Don't work whatever. It is a law for all time, throughout the ages, in all settlements. It shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you shall practice self-denial. On the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening to evening, you shall observe this your Sabbath. In the book of Numbers, the emphasis shifts from the rest and self-denial to sacrifice. On the 10th of the day, the same seventh month, you shall observe a sacred occasion, and you shall practice self-denial. You shall present the Lord burnt offering of pleasing odor, 1 bull of the herd, 1 ram, 7 yearling lambs. See that they are without blemish. The meal offering with them, a choice of flour, oil mixed, shall be 3/10 of a measure for a bull, 2/10 for the 1 ram, 1/10 for each of the 7 lambs. And there shall be 1 goat for a kin offering. In addition to this, to the sin offering of expiation and the regular burnt offering with its mean offering, each with its libation. In practice, the practice and the concept of vow, neder, though extensive in biblical period, is nowhere associated with either the atonement of the Day of Atonement service. It occurs primarily in the context of votive sacrifices to God, in making a commitment for which God is evoked as a guarantor, or family relations, or in family relationship. For example, and this is number 6:1-3. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone, man or woman, explicitly utters a Nazarite's vow to set himself apart for the Lord, he shall abstain from wine and any other intoxicants." The 30th chapter of Numbers, which is considered the chapter of vows, is devoted to the issues of vows, in which 2 of the core Nidre verbally radical roots, neder, to make a vow, or aser, to forbid yourself or forbid something, recur either as noun or verbs. In some way, this chapter sets the foundation for future debates about the issue. Moses spoke to the heads of the Israelite tribe, saying, "This is what the Lord has commanded. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his pledge. He must carry out all this that has crossed his lips. If a woman makes a vow to the Lord or assumes an obligation while still in her father's household by reason of her youth, and her father learns of her vow or self-imposed obligations and offers no objections, all her vows shall stand, and every self-imposed obligation shall stand. But if her father restrains her on the day he finds out, none of her vows or self-imposed obligation shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her, since her father restrained her." The biblical text continues in these veins, subjecting the wife to the authority of her husband, who replaces her father in that instance. Independent women, widows, divorcees assume their own responsibility for their vows and self-obligations. The biblical text, formed and developed in an oral society, places the responsibility of any vow or self-obligations upon the speaker. The Day of Atonement is nowhere associated with vow annulment, and the only way to relinquish the responsibility for what has been uttered in the votive mode is to retreat to a position of subordination, placing a woman in a legal position of a minor. During the period of the Second Temple, as the Mishnah describes it in the tractate Yomah, a tractate devoted to Yom Kippur, there is no mention of the Kol Nidre prayer. The Mishnah text concerns primarily with the conduct of the high priest, sacrifice, and fast. The nostalgic reconstruction of the Yom Kippur service by the Palestinian poets does not allude to Kol Nidre prayer either. Significantly, while the Mishnah devotes special tractate to both the Day of Atonement and to vows, two separate tracts, there is no association between them. And when the later rabbis commented and debated the teaching of these earlier rabbis, they did not find it necessary to make any cross-references between these two tractates. Negative evidence, of course, is by its very nature tentative. But so far, as much as it is possible to determine, Kol Nidre recitation in the synagogue service does not precede the 7th century. But when and where it was first manifested, it first manifested itself. During the 19th century, as I mentioned, some rabbi and scholars suggested that the prayer emerged among crypto Jews in Spain. A modified version of this theory retained Spain as the location of the originations, but pushed its dates from the 7th to the 7th century. From there, the same theory proposed that the prayer diffused to the Byzantium and then stabilized in Spain during the Inquisition. Documentary evidence invalidates these theories. Record from the Cairo Geniza, which is a deposit of medieval Jewish texts that was discovered in Cairo in the 19th century, and from earlier prayer books, either of Babylonian or Palestinian provenience of the prayer, suggest the Babylonian or Palestinian provenance of the prayer. The earliest documentation of the Kol Nidre recitation is the Hebrew text in the 9th century, Seder Rav Amram, the prayer book of Rabbi Amram, the earliest prayer book that Rabbi Amram Gaon, Amram ben Sheshet, died in 1875, prepared in response to a request of a rabbi from Barcelona, Spain. However, immediately following the Hebrew text, there appears a statement discounts its significance, qualifying it as minhag shtut, a stupid custom. This is, he wrote in the Siddur, said, that's stupid. It is possible, as some scholar argues, that this disqualification statement is a later insertion. It is always too easy to do that. However, it is too easy a solution we often take to delegate an apparent inconsistency to the later textual insertion. Rather, I would suggest that such a statement derives from a period in which the Kol Nidre had not been institutionalized in the service, and it is indeed of its somewhat ambivalent inclusion. It was included in the prayer with some ambivalence. Other Geonim that preceded Rabbi Amram Gaon, like Rabbi Yehuda ben Nachman from Sura and other rabbi, rejected the prayer as well, suggesting that its recitation was practiced in small towns, ayarot ktanot, probably lacking rabbinical authorities either in Babylonia or in Palestine. Their rejection indicates that the prayer was already known in the 8th century, albeit not accepted by the rabbinical authorities. Another scholar suggests that the recitation began to be practiced in even earlier period and then was diffused from Palestine to Babylonian and then back to Palestine. What emerges from this debate, however we settle it, is that the recitation of the Kol Nidre is a folk practice. Folk performance that was introduced into the service by the praying public rather than by the rabbinical authorities. Its inclusion in the Siddur, in the prayer book, is a rabbinical response to a pressure from the community, rather than the other way around, a learned composition that was taught and introduced by the rabbis. The argument about its country of origin is often marred by prejudice and preconceptions of the other. For example, once a major scholar, in a very learned article, Moshe David Herr, considered the language of the general population of Babylonian as filled with oaths and vows, and from whom the Jews learned this type of discourse, as if Jews spoke a more refined and polite language. I consider this reasoning faulty, and one cannot serve as a basis for any scholarly conclusion. The language of the Jews, at least as I know them, is not necessarily more refined than the language of any other ethnic group. The absence of spoken slang from the literary sources of the period is an indication of its literary nature rather than the language of the people. Furthermore, the reference to vows and oaths does not seem to be to the spoken use of body language, but to have a deeper foundation in the community. And this relates to the debate about the country of origin. I have here a sort of a paragraph that suggests that part of the discussion about the absolution of vows, there is text that suggests that this was not in Yom Kippur, but rather in Rosh Hashanah, 10 days earlier, and later on it was transferred to Yom Kippur. But this is sort of a debate, and there are several texts that suggest both possibilities. Once included in the Siddur, there have been two basic versions of the application of the absolutions of vows: past applications from previous Yom Kippur to the present, or future vows from the present till the next Yom Kippur. The issue involved in this debate is fundamental to the nature of absolutions. If it refers to the past vows, it is interpreted as an absolution of human foibles, human failures to fulfill obligations, mistakes in making them to begin with, and deliberate regrets in making them facing new and unexpected conditions. If they are addressed to the future vows, they give the Jews some insurance against making any careless vows. The third debate that is concerning the nature of the language is the most recent one. Although the discovery of the texts that are the basis of this debate is known to us for 100 years. Exactly the first publication of this text that I'm going to talk about was done in 1916 by Professor of Montgomery, who preceded me, not necessarily in the same role, but at the University of Pennsylvania, and it is based on balls and incantations that are found at the Museum of the University of Pennsylvania. This became prominent, this debate prominent as a result of archaeological discoveries of magic balls and incantations in which the language of the recitations appears in part. Phrases such Nidre, Isurei, Haramei, these are Aramaic terms that appears in the Kol Nidre prayers, appear on these magical balls that purports to cancel the effects of such incantations. The discoveries of these incantations introduced into Kol Nidre debate the most serious and emotionally charged split in the scholarly interpretations of the recitations. Although these incantations were known, as I said, early in the 20th century, they became part of the Kol Nidre debate only recently. Let me read you an example of this text that is found on this magical ball. Appointed, and this is a text from a ball, and I read the English translation. Appointed in this ball for the stealing and guarding of this house, for sealing and guarding of this house, dwelling in the body of Huna, son of Kopitai, that there should go out from him the tormentors, evil dreams, vows, and there shall go out from him the tormentors, evil dreams, curses, spells, and the word, when I say vows, the word Nidre appears there. Magic practices, devils, demons, Lilith, encroachments, and terrors. Such formulas are available in archaeological, the archaeologically discovered ball. And I'm skipping, I have about 20 examples here that basically repeat themselves, and they appear on different articles and published by different scholars. I would like to propose the discovery of the existence of variations on the Kol Nidre formula or elements of its incantations suggest not only a new context for the terms of the prayer, but a different semantic domain that they signify. In Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible and the Mishnah and the Talmud, the term vow, neder, indeed has legal connotation, and it was used in the context of social agreement. The procedure for the nullifications of such agreement is indeed a legal process, as it is spelled out in the Babylonian Talmud and as it is done in front of a jury of 3 unlearned people, gaining thereby public approval. However, the term neder is in the more popular language has a different meaning, which we can infer from the sequence of categories of speech enumerated in the Kol Nidre prayer. And this point, let me read I'll not read, put the Hebrew prayer, but let's say, maybe I should let you, no, I'll skip the Hebrew prayer. There are some of us who say, this is the English translation. There are some of us who do like that. Delegate a delegate of the community stand up on the eve of Yom Kippur and says like that, all of the vows, prohibitions, bans, oaths, and kiyumim that we vowed, prohibited, banned, swore, and brought upon our souls swearingly from the last fast of atonement until the coming fast of atonement. With all of them, we come before our Father in heaven. If we took a vow, there is no vow. If we prohibited, there is no prohibition. If we banned, there is no ban here. If we took an oath, there is not an oath here. If we made a kiyum, there is no kiyum here. The vow is essentially cancelled. The prohibition is essentially cancelled. The ban is essentially cancelled. The oath is essentially cancelled. Here, there is no vow, no prohibition, no ban, no swearing. But there is here forgiveness and pardon before our Father in heaven, as it is written in your scripture. Most of the interpretation of the recitations understood the vow in terms of legal use. But both rabbis and modern scholars, when they try to understand the meaning of the term, explore its use in the Bible, Mishnah, and Talmud. However, the terms and verbs are used in the recitations. However, the terms and the verbs used in the recitation create a semantic paradigm similar to semantic paradigm used in incantations and protective amulets. Therefore, the meanings of these terms should be understood from the current context of their use as they shed meanings upon each other. We have to understand this word it's as a part of language of the marketplace and the language of magic, not the received language of the sages and the scribes. The rarity of available records and testimony is not a confirmation of the meaning of the legal terms. The word neder went through a historical semantic change from vow to curse. And I would like to suggest to you that it is similar to the word swearing in English, that you can swear in something and say, I swear in God that I have not done it, or I have done it, or I will do it. And swear is also a profane language. And the word neder in Kol Nidre has the meaning, has changed the meaning over the years from the biblical period and from the Mishnaic and Talmudic periods through usage in folk communities and folk speech accumulated and absorbed the word also of curse. And therefore the meaning of the terms can be understood from there, and this can be understood from their counter terms. This recitation is basically dialogic, stating that the negative and its counter positive terms, what we have here and what we do not have here, forgiveness, pardon and atonement are not counter terms of any legal terms. In the annulment of vows and prohibitions, there aren't any references in the recitation of Kol Nidre to any vows that were not fulfilled or that were taken lightly by the people and regretted them afterwards. The notion of regret that is prominent in the legal discourse and in the current version recitation in modern synagogue is totally absent from the ancient Kol Nidre. In the conception of this recitation as a legalistic document, there would be a valid questions for the reasons of its occurrence on the day of Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, with Kol Nidre recitations. But if we consider these recitations of absolutions of vows and prohibitions as a ban on the terms of magic and terms of cursing and social tensions and expressions of ill will and jealousy in the community, the position of Kol Nidre in the service become clear. This is a cleansing ritual that purifies the community from the negative social tensions, emotions of anger and hatred that accumulates over the year like a plaque blocking the communication of positive human emotions. This is a ritual of purifications and social renewal. There was nothing in this ritual that nullifies contractual agreements and promises. The interpretations of the rabbis that tried to find a way out of this apparent paradox was a result of a confusion of semantic domains. The same words contained in the language. The humiliations of Jews in Europe and the censorship of the Reform rabbis that excised the prayer from the Siddur, from the prayer book, was also an unnecessary act, a result of misunderstanding. In its initial intent, and the use of Kol Nidre was a folk purification ritual that entered a normative prescribed synagogue service truly and literally as the voice of the people. It seems the discovery of the language of Kol Nidre in the magical world in the 7th and the 13th century in the Middle East was only partially interpreted. The existence of this incantation suggests a more fundamental features in the text. The term used in the recitations have a dual semantic domain. On the one hand, they draw and refer to discourse of law and contracts and bindings, but this is their biblical terms, and this is the term, meaning in the Bible and in the Talmud. But on the other hand, they draw upon language of incantation, vectorial language, curses, maledictions, bans, and other verbal representations of ill will. It is in this meaning that the text of the prayer is included in the Yom Kippur service. To conclude, the Kol Nidre is a communal mutual absolutions of any ill thought, verbal condemnation of fellow men, and the protection from any such thoughts or words by others. It is a communal cleansing verbal ritual that prepares the community to face the ultimate and the holiest day of annual judgments. Seen in this way, Kol Nidre is not a liability. It is not a nullification of vows or of agreement of any kinds, but the cleansing of the community from the community of social tensions, of ill thought, of jealousy, of other negative feelings that are part of the human social life. The legal vows are still standing, the agreements are still binding. What is gone, at least for the ritual moment of Yom Kippur, is the patina of ill thought that accumulates over the year. In this sense, Kol Nidre is a recitation of renewal and affirmation of communal cohesion and brotherhood, rather than, as it was interpreted, a way out of obligations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. here, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. A little bit of time anyway. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Simon Bronner, Distinguished Professor of American Studies and Folklore at Pennsylvania State University, Harrisburg, who is the chair of the AFS Jewish Folklore and Ethnology section, our co-sponsor for the lecture. Dr. Bronner is director of the Doctoral American Studies program, and he received his PhD in Folklore and American Studies from Indiana University in 2011. He's been editor of the journals Material Culture.
Before then.
What?
A little before then.
Oh, okay, 81 I said. Yeah, you're right. He became editor of the Encyclopedia of American Studies in 2011, has been editor of the journals Material Culture and Folklore Historian, and now edits book series entitled Material Worlds for the University Press of Kentucky and Jewish Cultural Studies for Littman. He's the author of many, many books, as we all know, and most recently has published Folklore, The Basics. It's hot off the press as of October 9th, 2016 by Routledge. We welcome Simon here tonight.
I'm happy to speak to you on the bar mitzvah year of the Don Yoder Lecture. You may also not know that this being the Hebrew year of 5777, it also happens to be the second bar mitzvah for Dan Ben-Amos. And therefore, it is appropriate that he gave you his drasha, or a learned address, that is coupled with the role of Yom Kippur sermons that are oftentimes to reflect on the past in order to talk about the future and communal redemption. He mentioned Don Yoder's attitude toward Jewish folklore, and I might add or imagine conversations and faculty meetings at the University of Pennsylvania, because I did find a quote from yet another colleague of that department, Roger Abrams, who declared in an address in Chicago that for me, all folklore is Jewish. What he meant by that is that when he was asked about his interest in African American folklore, he said that this drew naturally from his experience with Jewishness because of the emphasis on looking at others and understanding oneself. I can extend that to note other folklorists such as Joseph Jacobs, who as editor of the journal Folklore tried to point out to his colleagues on the great team of folklorists, as Richard Dorson dubbed them, that the basics of folklore theory and methodology are based upon Jewish learning because of the hermeneutics of multilingual, variable, and migratory texts, the interpretation of everyday and ceremonial context, sensitivity to community and otherness, and attention to continuity and change in practice. Dan probably shares with me at least some experience as yeshiva bicher in which instead of the pedagogy of being lectured to as we're used to in our university lecture hall, students were paired up and grappled over original texts and evaluated interpretations by rabbinical sages in the Mishnah and other texts that were pasted into pages of multiple sidebars. And this preceded, in fact, what we think of as the hypertext style of modern websites. I found that very comfortable to have all kinds of sidebars because of that experience. But the importance of this, I believe, is the evaluation of texts in their historical and cultural manifestations. If I had a shekel for every time tradition was mentioned in those yeshiva experiences, I would be rich indeed. Because a necessary reference was the minchadim, which roughly translates to custom, but with special attention to the groups of which customs are a part in different parts of the Jewish world. A related idea of nusach refers to the order and form of prayers. So already built into the discourse is attention to structuralism as well as the expression of that culture. In this concept is an inherent dilemma for Jewish communities, and you can decide whether this is distinctive or unique to the practice of Jewish folk religion. While rabbis applied the religious tenets of Judaism, the people identified being Jewish with local practice. The rabbis afforded families, even encouraged them to control minchagim in the home, and hoped that people would acquiesce to the rabbis in the synagogue as a different institutional and sacred context. This tension was evidenced in the emergence, for example, of Sukkot, which we're celebrating this week, the rise of the bar mitzvah, and indeed the Kol Nidre rite. In fact, Kol Nidre was, I think, made sacred by the rabbis in treating it as the beginning of the service. It is rather unusual, he didn't mention this, but we had talked about this, that Kol Nidre is a metaphor for the entire service. So we would often say, are you going to Kol Nidre? This is not to say you're just going for the rite, but you're going for the entire service, whereas with other aspects of the Jewish liturgy, you refer to whether it's the morning service, the afternoon service, or the evening service. It is also set apart from others because it's the one time in the evening when you would wear a talit. Otherwise, you would only wear it on Shabbat during the day. And the simulation, and this is a part maybe we part, but it seems that there is a folk drama evident because what occurs is a simulation of a bet din, a simulation of a rabbinical court where you would have three people stand in front, the ark is open, and there is a sense of judgment which in fact structures an order of movement of the service from looking or the perception of God as a God of judgment to one of mercy. And that even includes some wordplay in a very serious service. It is true, it's the most sacred, the most holy, but then along the way, the singing of the Shema, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, is different on this time. The Lord our God, a very basic incantation, because the cantor intentionally inserts Shemon for Shema. This is not because the cantor loves me, but because this is a kind of play that is going on with this idea that there is a familiar relationship with God during this liminal time that is defined. It is also true, as Dan said, that it is a time filled of tension because of the exoteric awareness that this ritual, this rite, can be taken negatively against Jews. And in addition, Kol Nidre was a time, at least in some of the records we have, when synagogues were open to Christians. So Kol Nidre was fascinating to Christians as well as this communal time. Tolstoy mentions it, and he talks about Kol Nidre as the plaintive cry of a grief-stricken nation. I'm not sure if the Jews in the congregation felt that way, but this is the way he viewed it. Beethoven included it in his, at least the musical melody, in his music, and probably most prevalent is that the world knows it through the jazz singer in Al Jolson, in which the climax is whether Al Jolson will make a choice between singing of jazz or replacing his father singing Kol Nidre. The movie does not end telling you whether he's returned to Judaism or not. It ends with this expressive act, maybe to say that he can be both. And this was repeated with perhaps odd characters in your view of Jerry Lewis in 1959 singing Kol Nidre, Danny Thomas in 1957 singing Kol Nidre, and Neil Diamond in 1980. In addition, in the Yiddish world, Kol Nidre was the name of a Yiddish film produced by Joseph Seiden, and there's also a film, The Vow, and also the Dybbuk, that all seem to be based, if not on Kol Nidre, around the Vilna legend. And this is where I'm returning it somewhat to folklore. The Vilna legend is this idea that parents should not make vows for their children. But this does, and there's tragedy because they do, and the children are ill-starred. In the future, Peretz, the Yiddish literary writer who also led, Ansky, who led a folklore expedition, certainly is famed for adapting this as well, perhaps again because of the central importance and symbolism of the vow in the Jewish imagination. In fact, among the Hasidim, there's even another custom of, on Rosh Hashanah, petitioning a Jewish court to talk about vows. In my Machzor, which is a prayer book just for the holidays, among the conservative branch of Judaism, there is an interpretation on the side. It was not written by Dan Ben-Amos, but this is, I think, a modern variation of this, where the rabbis are troubled that the congregants may misinterpret what is occurring and trying to tell them what its meaning is. And I was telling Dan that at least in my synagogue, the machzor they use, which is supposed to be a modern one, goes to great lengths to say that the nullification of vows is not between humans to humans, but between human and God. It's an individual relationship to God. I do agree that Nidre is a folk practice, but that can be seen also as a folk drama, and it does have a social communal cleansing that seems to relate to some kind of filial piety that bridges the home and the synagogue in the Jewish experience. And again, my intoning the idea of the bar mitzvah, there is a lot of perhaps bookending in the service because of its ending of resounding the 13 attributes of God's name during that time. Dan and some of you know that I do use psychoanalytic interpretation for some of this material. Dan seemed hesitant to go there, but I might mention Theodor Reich is a psychoanalyst of Jewish ritual, and he does have a psychoanalytic interpretation. Don't worry, it doesn't have to do with circumcision, but rather he talks about Kol Nidre as being important to even non-Jews or those who are susceptible to non-observance, because he thinks that it enacts for them and maybe cleanses them from the guilt of being within the world and away from Jewish piety, and that it enacts an unconscious tribalism. And Jews do refer to one another, tribe, as someone a member of the tribe, and somehow this enters in with the discourse related to vows, and it might be something that Dan can speak to as well. And even in the modern world, the persistence, at least, of the discourse of tribalism, even with a recognition of living within a popular world. So I'm going to open it up to you, but I do want to say to Dan and all of you, Kativa Fechatima Tova, Shana Tova, Desos Hubana Gityor, which is all to say, may you be inscribed and sealed for a good year.
Do you want me to? Simon brought the Kol Nidre to the modern times, to Al Jolson and the synagogues of today and the customs of today. And this is really, it is very, and also brought Theodor Reich interpretations or it's a long essay in his book on ritual that deals with called Nidre. I tried to do what some other people have done, but I took issue with their interpretations, asking about the origin and how of Kol Nidre and how the hell are we using it? Why? Because it appears to be contradictory to any social order. And my conclusion was that there is here a semantic development of a term that developed in different quarters, in different parts of the society. There is the folk use of the term neder, vow, swearing, and the magical use of the term, basically using neder in the magical balls that I mentioned to you. It is used as a word that appears in the context of protect me from the curses, from the nedarim of other people. So this is a bowl that was placed in the house, in the opening, in the windows or the doors, the gates to the house, as an amulet to protect people from the evil that appears outside. I must admit that the interpretations that I came upon, I wouldn't say inspired by, but let's say my experience in Africa helped me to get these interpretations. In Africa, you don't have a bowl that placed in front of the house, but you will have the image of Eshu, the trickster deity that will face outside the house and that you will not get into, will avoid and prevent disorder in the house. You have rituals that are designed, their purpose is to keep the town clean. This is in Benin, let's say, Ekpo ritual was basically to keep the town clean. And I think that what we have in Kol Nidre is an attempt to keep the town clean, to keep, let's forget all my evil thought that I had against you, they are annulled. Let's forget all the curses, all the conflicts that we had between us, they are annulled. Maybe next year there will be other things, but let's say this is a moment of renewal and of communal renewal. I would go even further. Edmund Leach had wonderful articles about rituals and the order in the annual religious cycle. And he suggests that there is a connection. Say, Yom Kippur is not isolated from the previous rituals that we have in Judaism. The Rosh Hashanah rituals ends with an actual ritual that the community goes to the river and does something that is called tashlich, throwing away all the sins. These are, but let's say, sins of the individuals. People just get rid from, they don't bathe in the river as it would have done probably in Africa. But here they throw to the river all their sins. The Yom Kippur is a communal purification, not an individual purification, but a communal purification, basically to get rid of everything evil that existed in the community. And look, people say you don't need to be a folklorist to know that social life is not a panacea. Say social life has conflicts, has crime, crime that is known, crime that is done undercover. We are not saints. And for one moment in our life, let's say ritualistically, if we do not become saints, but we try to get clean, to have a community that is ready to start anew. And I think this is the point of Kol Nidre. And it seems to me that the rabbis, they started from, and I'll use a term that is used in modern scholarly discourse, from the narrative of the laws that they studied. The narrative that you have in the Talmud, in the Mishnah and the Talmud, narrative that discusses these terms basically as legal terms. But this is a different context. And this is not the contradiction between their narratives that they came with to the religious text that they confronted, created these notions of a problem, enigma, and a paradox. I would go even further. Most of the scholars that I didn't go and I didn't drop all their names because most of the publications that I read for that are in Hebrew, try to interpret the term neder and all the other terms in terms of legal terms as they appear in the magical amulets and the magical balls. I think this is wrong. The reference for these terms is not the Talmud, is not the Mishnah, and for that matter, it is not the Bible. The reference for these terms as the street language of the community of the 7th century, 8th century, 9th century. They learned it. I don't think that Jews necessarily speak in a pure language or it's a refined language. Jews know how to curse, and there is a book that about Jewish curses in Yiddish, and until now you can find it, and it's a wonderful book. Growing up in Israel in a Jewish community, I heard body language, rough language, you know, say, and I don't think that if you read the Jewish jokes, and let's say Tzafi is here working on the erotic or bodily humor of that appears in Jewish society. Jews are not saints, no matter what you say. And I think they have the right and the rituals to purify themselves for a moment and then say, and from now on, well, we'll try, but we know that we'll not succeed. And we'll need another year to make recite the Kol Nidre again.
We have a couple of questions, maybe just a bit, because we have to end pretty soon.
Can you come here? I don't hear very well.
Or there's a microphone.
Yeah, the microphone.
I was curious about, let's see, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is this
Yes.
okay? I was curious about what you were saying about the stabilization of the Kol Nidre during the Inquisition, and this was disproved by, I think you mean Professor Goitein's Geniza documents, studies. And I'm just curious, the Geniza, Geniza was comprised of receipts and bills and all kinds of documents pertaining to the economic life and social life of the Jewish community in medieval Cairo. And I'm just wondering what the Kol Nidre would have meant to that community, and if there's any discourse on it. I mean, that would have been it's a very prosperous time, or at least it's what we have. It's a very prosperous. So I'm curious, would the medieval Jews of Cairo have gone and said, well, we're going to Kol Nidre? I'm just picking up on Dr. Bonner's comment, which is interesting, but that's very modern. So is there anything in the discourse that can tell us more about that enigma and the dilemma? I mean, it's a new context in essence. I mean, maybe it took a few hundred years, but a new context and a different semantic domain.
In the Geniza, this is an article that I refer to articles by a really great scholar by the name of Shraga Abramson, and he read this text not in contracts or legal contracts, but in the Geniza there are also midrashim and the Mishnah and a lot of text and prayer books. And he refers to that people mention, and I don't have with me, I have the reference I can give you, but say I don't have the text with me, that a person mentioned that, let's say, they say Kol Nidre, or they absolve people from vows in the small towns of Palestine, of Israel, of Eretz Israel at that time. And he used the words nedarim. My point is that when he calls it absolution, absolving people from vows of nedarim, still the usage there is a folk use, and it is not a Talmudic context, but it is a ritualistic context of the folk. Yeah. Yes.
One more maybe?
Excuse me, being Muslim and yes, but I think in Islam, it is said, if you are a genuine Muslim, misbehave, go with women, steal, because God will forgive you. Unless you do this, you are not a good believer. So I think this might explain the contradiction in these contentions.
Well, stealing is from the Ten Commandments forbidden.
Okay.
Yeah, this is not a question of stealing. This is
whatever.
It is the reference, the legal interpretation, not my interpretation of the term. The legal interpretation refers to verbal commitments. Basically, it is very interesting, let's say, in the chapter 30th of the book of Numbers, there is a statement that says, you should not go back on your words. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, they repeat this statement and say there is a very interesting conclusion that says you shouldn't go back on your vows because God don't have tolerance for fools. So the consideration of this behavior as a foolish behavior. God, loss of el-ksilim, this is the term that is used. It is a stronger, it's not just fools, but stupid people. And the person that goes back on vows is considered stupid. Now, you have to, this is the whole point of my analysis, that we have to separate the use of the term in the Bible in later sources. And I suggest that there was a new meaning, a new usage of the terms in the 7th, 8th centuries that the rabbis did not understand.
Okay, thank you.
If you take a professor from the university and take him to the streets of where people speak slang, very often, if he's a folklorist, he will try to study it. But if he is not a folklorist, he will be baffled by it, you know, because people use words in a different context, in a different way. And I think this is a case where words from oral discourse of unlearned levels of the society entered into the prayer book, not because the people wanted it, because it was important for them. And the rabbi tolerated it because they couldn't prevent it.
Okay, thank you very much.
I might just add as a coda, though, generalizing from this, I think the contribution you're making is to try to break apart what we have had as a binary where we're talking about religious folklore as being within the home and the street, and then what occurs in the church or the synagogue is liturgical, so the world of folklore doesn't enter into that, and I think you are, in a general sense, for our different sections that are sponsoring this, suggesting that there is a category of liturgical folklore and that we should be willing to look at those texts and those practices in terms of tradition.
I would like to, I like the way you put it, but what I'm trying to suggest is that the folk tradition entered into liturgical folklore, sometimes against the wills of the liturgists themselves.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree.
Do we have another hand? Applause? Thank you. I'm just going to give you a quick reminder that our section will be meeting at noon on Saturday, and we'll be announcing the Don Yoder Prize for the best graduate student paper at that time. Thank you.